The silence didn't come with screaming. It didn't come with doors slamming or voices raised in anger. It came quietly, so quietly that Thomas didn't notice it at first. He noticed it later, standing alone in the living room, staring at the wall where the family photos hung. His ears strained for a sound that should have been there. A laugh, a question, the shuffle of feet coming down the stairs. Nothing. Upstairs, his son's bedroom door was closed. Not slammed, not locked, just closed. That was the moment Thomas felt something he couldn't explain. A tightness in his chest. A feeling that something important had shifted. Not in the house, but between him and his child. He told himself it was discipline. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself every parent goes through moments like this. What Thomas didn't understand yet was that the lesson he thought he had taught hadn't corrected behavior. It had taken something away. And silence, once learned as protection, doesn't disappear easily. Ethan had always been a talker. Not loud, not reckless, just curious. The kind of child who asked questions while brushing his teeth and followed his father from room to room with half-finished thoughts. Why do people lie? How do you know when someone's mad? Did you ever get scared when you were a kid? Thomas used to answer patiently, sometimes distracted, sometimes tired, but always present, until life became heavier. Long hours at work, bills stacking up, a constant pressure to do things right. Thomas grew up believing rules made people strong, that discipline kept chaos away. So when Thomas discovered that Ethan had hidden a poor grade, something inside him snapped into certainty. Lying. That word echoed louder than the mistake itself. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas asked, voice firm. Ethan hesitated, just a second too long. "I forgot," Ethan said. Thomas heard the fear beneath the words, but he ignored it. "I don't tolerate dishonesty," Thomas said. "You know that." Ethan tried to explain. His words came out tangled. His eyes dropped to the floor. Thomas mistook fear for excuse, and in a moment that would replay in his mind for years to come, Thomas chose punishment instead of understanding. Afterward, Ethan didn't cry. That surprised Thomas. He expected tears, anger, resistance. Instead, Ethan stood quietly, nodded once, and walked upstairs. Thomas remained in the living room, heart pounding, convincing himself this was how lessons were learned. Dinner came and went. Ethan didn't come down. Thomas noticed the empty chair but didn't call him. He needs time, Thomas thought. Later that night, Thomas walked past Ethan's room. The light was on, but the room was silent. He knocked. "Yes?" Ethan answered softly. Thomas opened the door. Ethan sat on his bed, hands folded tightly in his lap, eyes red but dry. "You didn't eat," Thomas said. "I wasn't hungry." "We'll talk tomorrow," Thomas replied. Ethan nodded. No argument, no emotion, just silence. The next morning felt different. Ethan moved through the house like a visitor. He dressed quietly, ate without speaking, cleaned his plate and placed it in the sink. "Yes, sir." "No, sir." "Okay." Thomas noticed, and at first he felt relief. It worked, he told himself, but something felt wrong. At school drop-off, Ethan didn't linger like he used to. He stepped out of the car without looking back. "Have a good day," Thomas said. Ethan nodded, already walking away. Thomas sat in the car longer than necessary, watching the doors close. Days passed. The house stayed quiet. Ethan still followed rules, still did his homework, still behaved perfectly. But he stopped talking. He stopped asking questions, stopped sharing stories, stopped laughing. Thomas tried to ignore the growing knot in his chest. On Thursday night, he finally asked, "Why don't you talk to me anymore?" Thomas said at dinner. Ethan froze. "I am talking," he replied carefully. "You barely say anything. If you have something to say, say it." Ethan looked up slowly, calm, distant. "You wanted me quiet," he said. Thomas frowned. "That's not—" "So I am," Ethan finished. The words landed heavy. Not loud, not angry, just honest. That night, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his own childhood, about how silence had kept him safe, how obedience had meant survival. Had he taught his son the same lesson? Near midnight, Thomas stood outside Ethan's door, hand raised to knock. He stopped. What if he didn't know how to fix this? Inside the room, Ethan was laying awake too, staring at the wall. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even sad. He had decided something important. Talking wasn't safe. Silence was. And neither of them yet understood how deeply that decision would change everything.
The silence didn't scare Thomas right away. At first, it felt like calm. The house ran smoother, mornings were efficient, evenings were quiet. Ethan followed rules without reminders. He did his homework early, cleaned his room without being asked, and kept his head down. On the surface, everything looked fixed. But Thomas began to notice the cost in small, unsettling ways. Ethan stopped leaving his door open. He stopped humming while brushing his teeth. He stopped asking questions in the car. The boy who used to narrate his thoughts now moved through the house like he was afraid of making noise. One evening, Thomas came home early and found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook open, pencil hovering above the page. "What are you working on?" Thomas asked. Ethan flinched slightly before answering. "Math." Thomas glanced at the page. It was almost blank. "Need help?" he asked. Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, I'll figure it out." Thomas nodded and walked away, but the image stayed with him. A child, frozen, afraid to make a mistake. The school called 2 days later, not because Ethan was in trouble, because he wasn't. "Ethan's grades are steady," the counselor said carefully, "but he's very withdrawn. He doesn't raise his hand anymore. He avoids attention." Thomas frowned. "He's not acting out?" "No," she replied. "He's acting invisible." That word stayed with Thomas long after the call ended. Invisible. That night, Thomas watched Ethan eat dinner in silence, eyes on his plate. "You can talk, you know," Thomas said gently. Ethan paused. "Okay." But nothing followed. Thomas realized then that silence wasn't something Ethan was choosing in the moment. It was something he had learned. Later that night, Thomas stood outside Ethan's room again. "Can I come in?" he asked. Ethan nodded. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. "I want to understand something," he said. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Ethan stared at his hands. "I'm not angry anymore. I just want to know what you're feeling." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know." Thomas waited. After a long pause, Ethan spoke quietly. "It's easier to be quiet." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. Easier than what? Easier than saying the wrong thing. Easier than making it worse. Thomas realized then that silence had become Ethan's shield. Not rebellion, not disrespect. Protection. Thomas thought back to his own childhood. He remembered learning early that mistakes had consequences, that explanations sounded like excuses, that silence was safer than honesty. He had sworn he would be different, yet here he was watching his son live by the same rule. The next morning, Thomas tried something new. When Ethan came downstairs late, Thomas noticed the clock and said nothing. He poured Ethan a glass of juice and slid it across the counter. "Bus comes in 10 minutes, he said calmly. Ethan looked up, confused. "I'm not in trouble?" "No," Thomas said. "You're not." Ethan nodded slowly, relief flickering across his face. It was a small moment, but it mattered. That afternoon, Thomas picked Ethan up from school. The car ride was quiet, but not tense. Ethan stared out the window, fingers tapping against his leg. "Wanna grab food?" Thomas asked. Ethan turned, surprised. "Like, together?" "Yes," Thomas said. They sat in a small diner near the park. Vinyl seats, old menus, familiar place. Thomas ordered Ethan's favorite without asking. Ethan noticed.
They ate quietly for a few minutes before Ethan spoke. "I thought you'd always see me as the kid who lied," he said softly. Thomas set his fork down. "I don't." Ethan nodded. "It felt like you did." Thomas swallowed. "I was scared, not of you, of failing as a parent." Ethan looked up. "You were scared?" "Yes," Thomas said. "I didn't know how else to react." Ethan leaned back, processing. "I didn't know that." The silence between them felt different now, not sharp, not dangerous. That night, Ethan didn't go straight to his room. He lingered in the living room while Thomas folded laundry. "Dad?" Ethan said. "Yeah?" Thomas looked up. "I want to tell you something, but I don't want to get in trouble." Thomas met his eyes. "You won't." Ethan hesitated. "Promise?" "I promise," Thomas said. Ethan took a deep breath. "I didn't understand the homework. Everyone else seemed to get it. I felt stupid." Thomas felt something crack inside him. Not anger, not disappointment, but recognition. "I thought if I told you, you'd think I wasn't trying," Ethan continued. Thomas shook his head slowly. "I never thought that." Ethan shrugged. "It felt like you did." Thomas nodded. "I should have asked why before deciding how to respond." Ethan nodded too. "I should have told the truth." They sat there together, the truth resting between them, quiet but safe. Over the next few days, Thomas kept choosing differently. When Ethan made small mistakes, Thomas paused. When frustration rose, he listened instead of reacting. It didn't fix everything overnight, but something shifted. Ethan began asking small questions again, about homework, about movies, about random things that crossed his mind. The silence loosened its grip. One evening, as they walked around the neighborhood, Ethan spoke quietly. "I don't feel as scared anymore." Thomas stopped walking. "You shouldn't have felt scared at all." Ethan nodded. "I know." Thomas realized something then. The punishment hadn't taught discipline. It had taught fear, and fear had stolen his son's voice. That night, Thomas lay awake thinking about how close he had come to losing something precious without realizing it. He understood now that silence wasn't peace. It was a warning, and if he wanted to raise a child who spoke honestly, he had to be someone safe to speak to.
Thomas didn't announce the change he was trying to make. He just started making it. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions without rushing the answers. When Ethan hesitated, Thomas waited, long enough for the silence to feel inviting instead of dangerous. It was uncomfortable at first. Thomas had spent most of his life believing that authority meant being certain, that good parenting meant quick decisions and firm reactions. Waiting felt like weakness. Listening felt like losing control. But every time Thomas resisted the urge to correct, he noticed something small but important. Ethan stayed. On Monday morning, Ethan came downstairs later than usual. His backpack was half-zipped, his hair still damp. Thomas glanced at the clock and felt the old reflex spark. Instead of speaking, he poured Ethan a glass of water and slid it across the counter. "Bus comes in 10 minutes, Thomas said. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Okay." No tension, no fear. At the door, Ethan paused, hand on the knob. He looked back. "Bye, Dad," he said. Thomas smiled. "Have a good day." Ethan left, and this time the door didn't feel like it was closing something off. That afternoon, Thomas picked Ethan up from school and suggested they stop by the library. It was a place Ethan used to love but hadn't asked about in weeks. They walked the aisles quietly at first. Ethan ran his fingers along the spines of books, stopping now and then like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. "You can pick anything," Thomas said. Ethan hesitated. "Even if it's not for school?" "Especially if it's not for school," Thomas replied. Ethan smiled, small, cautious, but real, and picked a book about space exploration. At the checkout desk, Ethan spoke softly. "I used to think asking questions made me annoying." Thomas looked at him. "Who told you that?" He shrugged. "No one. I just learned it." Thomas felt a familiar ache. Questions are how people learn, and how parents understand their kids. Ethan absorbed the words like something fragile.
That evening, as Thomas cooked dinner, Ethan sat at the counter watching. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas turned off the stove. "Always." Ethan took a breath. "Were you scared of your dad?" The question landed gently, but it landed deep. Thomas leaned against the counter. "Yes," he said honestly, "a lot." Ethan's eyes widened. "Did he ever listen?" Thomas shook his head. "Not the way I needed him to." Ethan looked down. "Is that why you got mad so fast?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I learned that mistakes meant consequences, not conversations. I didn't realize I was passing that on." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought if I stayed quiet, I wouldn't make you mad again." Thomas's chest tightened. "I'm sorry I made you feel that way." Ethan nodded. "I know you didn't mean to, but I did, and that matters." The school counselor called again later that week. This time, the tone was different. Ethan spoke up in class, asked for help, shared an idea. Thomas closed his eyes, relief washing over him. "Thank you for telling me." That night, Thomas mentioned it carefully. "Your teacher called," he said. Ethan stiffened, then relaxed when Thomas smiled. "She said you asked a question today." Ethan shrugged, trying to hide his pride. "I didn't want to fall behind." "I'm proud of you." Ethan froze. "You are?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "For speaking, for trying." Ethan nodded, his eyes glossy but steady. A few nights later, Ethan knocked on Thomas's bedroom door. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. "Of course." They sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders nearly touching. "I want to tell you something, the real reason I didn't talk." Thomas waited. "I was scared you'd stop loving me," Ethan said quietly, "if I messed up too much." Thomas felt the words like a physical weight. "That would never happen." "I know that now, but I didn't then." Thomas swallowed. "I should have made that clearer." Ethan nodded. "I should have told you how scared I was." They sat together, letting the truth breathe. Over the next weeks, the house slowly changed. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then easier. Ethan started telling stories again, asking questions, making jokes that made Thomas groan and smile at the same time. Mistakes still happened, but now they talked about them. One evening, Ethan missed curfew by 15 minutes. He walked in, nervous but honest. "I lost track of time," he said. Thomas paused, then nodded. "Thanks for telling me. Next time, text." Ethan blinked. "That's it?" "That's it," Thomas said. Ethan smiled, a real one this time. One quiet night, Thomas stood in the living room where it had all started. The same clock ticked on the wall, the same couch, the same light. But the silence was gone. In its place was something better. Trust. Thomas understood now that the lesson he thought he had taught wasn't the one his son needed. What Ethan needed wasn't fear to guide him, but safety. And Thomas learned something too, that discipline without listening can silence a child, that silence is not obedience, it's self-protection, and that the bravest thing a parent can do is admit when they were wrong. The real story wasn't about punishment. It was about a voice that almost disappeared, and a father who learned to listen before it was too late. Trust didn't return in a dramatic moment. It returned quietly, through consistency. Thomas noticed it in the way Ethan lingered in doorways again, unsure whether to enter a room or retreat. He noticed it when Ethan started asking small questions, testing the space between them, checking if it was truly safe. "Do you think this answer makes sense? Can you look at this? Is it okay if I try it my way?" Each question felt like a fragile offering. And each time Thomas answered calmly, without judgment, the space between them softened just a little more. One evening, Thomas came home to find Ethan sitting on the couch, backpack still on, staring at the TV without really watching it. "Rough day?" Thomas asked. Ethan shrugged. "Kind of." Thomas sat beside him, not too close, not too far. "Wanna talk about it?" Ethan hesitated. "I messed up in class." Thomas felt the old instinct stir, but he stayed still. "What happened?" "I gave the wrong answer," Ethan said. People laughed. Thomas nodded slowly. That's hard. Ethan glanced at him, surprised. You're not mad? Why would I be? Thomas replied. I don't know, Ethan said quietly. I thought you'd think I embarrassed myself. Thomas shook his head. Making mistakes means you're trying. Ethan leaned back against the couch, tension easing. That's not what it used to feel like. I know, Thomas said. I'm trying to change that. Ethan nodded. I can tell. A few days later, Thomas received another call from the school. This time, the counselor sounded thoughtful. Ethan's opening up again, she said, but I wanted to ask, has something changed at home? Thomas hesitated, then answered honestly. Yes, I realized I was reacting instead of listening. The counselor paused. That makes a difference. Thomas hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment, letting that sink in. That weekend, Thomas suggested they work in the garage together. It was something they used to do often, small projects, simple repairs. Ethan agreed. They worked side by side, the quiet filled with the sound of tools and occasional comments. At one point, Ethan dropped a screw. It rolled under the workbench. Both of them froze. Thomas felt the memory rise, the old reflex to react sharply. Instead, he smiled. Happens all the time. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Later, as they cleaned up, Ethan spoke softly. I still get scared sometimes. Thomas nodded. Me too. Ethan looked at him. Really? Yes, Thomas said. But being scared doesn't mean we stop talking. It means we talk more. Ethan thought about that. I like that. That night, Ethan knocked on Thomas's bedroom door. Can I stay here for a bit? He asked. Of course, Thomas said. They sat together, quiet but comfortable. I used to think being quiet made things safer. Now I think talking does. Thomas smiled. I think you're right. Ethan leaned against the headboard. I don't feel invisible anymore. The words hit Thomas harder than any accusation ever could. I never wanted you to feel invisible, he said. I know, Ethan replied. But I did. Thomas nodded. Thank you for telling me. Over the next weeks, life tested them. Ethan missed an assignment. He came home nervous but honest. I forgot, he said. I'm sorry. Thomas paused, then nodded. Thanks for telling me. Let's figure out how to fix it. Ethan blinked. That's it? That's it, Thomas said. Ethan smiled. Another day, Ethan stayed out later than planned. He texted instead of hiding it. Running late, the message read. Be home soon. Thomas replied, Thanks for letting me know. Each moment rebuilt something quietly. One evening, as they walked through the neighborhood, the sky turning orange and purple, Ethan said, I think that day changed us. Thomas nodded. It did. But not in the way you thought, Ethan added. No, said Thomas, in the way we needed. They walked in silence, not the fearful kind, but the kind that felt shared. That night, Thomas stood in the living room again, looking at the same photos on the wall. He thought about how close he had come to confusing obedience with trust, how easily silence could be mistaken for respect. He understood now that discipline without safety doesn't teach responsibility, it teaches fear. And fear silences. Upstairs, Ethan laughed quietly at something on his phone. The sound drifted down the hallway, light and unexpected. Thomas closed his eyes, letting it settle into him. The house was no longer quiet. It was alive again. The house didn't change overnight. It changed in rhythms. Thomas noticed it in the mornings first. Ethan started lingering again, standing in the kitchen doorway, asking small questions that didn't really need answers. Is it supposed to rain today? Do you think this shirt looks okay? Can I show you something later? They were simple words, but each one felt like a step back towards something fragile that had almost disappeared. One evening, Thomas came home to find Ethan sitting on the floor with old photo albums spread around him. "Found these in the closet," Ethan said. "You were really bad at haircuts." Thomas laughed. "I did my best." Ethan smiled and kept flipping pages. "You used to ask me questions back then. About school, about my drawings." Thomas sat beside him. "I stopped asking." Ethan nodded. "I noticed." They sat quietly, turning pages, letting the truth rest where it belonged, out in the open, not hidden behind fear. A few days later, life tested them again. Ethan came home later than expected, shoulders tight, eyes worried. Thomas felt the old tension rise, but he stayed still. "I messed up," Ethan said. "I stayed longer than I said I would." Thomas nodded. "Thanks for telling me." Ethan waited, bracing. "We'll talk about timing," Thomas said calmly, "but I'm glad you told the truth." Ethan blinked. "You're not mad?" "I'm concerned. That's different." Ethan exhaled slowly, relief washing over his face. That was the moment Thomas understood the difference he'd been missing all along. Fear shuts doors. Safety opens them. That weekend, Thomas suggested they take a walk at dusk. The neighborhood was quiet, the sky soft with color. They walked side by side, hands in pockets. "I used to think being quiet made me good," Ethan said suddenly. Thomas turned. "What do you think now?" "I think being honest makes me safe," Ethan replied. Thomas nodded, "and being safe makes honesty possible." They continued walking, the rhythm of their steps matching. "I want to tell you something," Ethan said. "The day everything changed, I decided something." Thomas waited. "I decided that if I didn't talk, nothing bad could happen again. Silence felt like control." Thomas felt the weight of that settle in his chest. "I'm sorry you felt like silence was your only option." Ethan looked up. "It's not anymore." Thomas stopped walking. "I promise to keep it that way." Ethan nodded. "I believe you." That night, Thomas stood alone in the living room, the same room where it had all begun. The clock ticked. The light hummed softly. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't protecting anything. It was simply quiet. Thomas understood something clearly now. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's a warning. Children don't always cry when they're hurt. They don't always rebel when they're afraid. Sometimes they go quiet. And that quiet can be easy to misread as obedience. Thomas had learned the hard way that discipline without listening doesn't build character, it builds walls. In the weeks that followed, Ethan laughed more, asked questions again, made mistakes and talked about them instead of hiding them. Thomas still set rules, still believed in guidance, but he understood now that authority works best when it's paired with humility. One evening, as Ethan headed upstairs, he stopped and turned back. "Dad? Yeah? Thanks for listening." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Thank you for speaking." Ethan smiled and disappeared into his room, leaving the door open. Later that night, Thomas thought about how close he had come to losing something precious, not through anger, but through certainty. He had been so sure he was right that he stopped being curious. And curiosity, he realized, is the bridge between discipline and understanding. The real lesson wasn't about punishment. It was about what children learn when they feel unsafe. Silence can be learned. Fear can be learned. But so can trust, if someone is willing to change. Thomas knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could choose differently now. And sometimes that's enough. This is a real story, not because it happened exactly this way, but because it happens everywhere. When punishment replaces conversation, when fear replaces safety, when silence replaces trust. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect, not on what rules you enforce, but on how safe the people around you feel when they speak. If this story moved you, Please like the video, subscribe for more real-life emotional stories, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today.